week 8. Are we week 8 or week 9? I don't remember. We are going to talk this week. We are talking this week about philosophies of war and philosophies of violence. I changed the curriculum up for what we would ordinarily be doing at this time because there are some things happening in the world that deserve some reflection and thought. Not that any of us this week, after doing this week's reading, are ready to head off to the Middle East and to Palestine and Israel and start to negotiate a peace treaty. But at the very least, we might have some better understanding of what is happening in the world in different spots where violence erupts and then goes away and then erupts and then goes away, where sometimes violence leads to conflict, which leads to battles, war. There is, of course, a lot of discussion right now about whether or not what's happening in Israel and in Gaza is war. Lots of media places like to use the word war whenever they can, um, or whether it is just further acts of aggression and oppression, or further acts of terrorism. Um, there's a lot of people trying to figure out what is happening and how to label it. For our purposes, we want to think a little bit about philosophy and how philosophy enters into these discussions. Of course, we want to be very sensitive as we do this to people's identities, their families, the very real cost of violence that is happening around the world. That violence that happens in the United States as a result of the political conflicts that are happening elsewhere. I don't want to make light of what's happening over in Israel and Gaza, and certainly I would never do that. But I'm going to start by talking about hitting and a philosophy of hitting, because at its very basic root, war is a violent act between persons, two people, one often who is the victim of violence and the other is who is the perpetrator of violence. So I want to think about hitting and why we hit, how hitting happens. Don't know about you. I was spanked as a kid. I was spanked quite often, and the spanking was never like terribly out of control violence where an adult was hitting me because they couldn't control themselves. It was always a hitting that was presumably as a result of my actions and punishment. I was spanked by my parents, and my parents loved me. I have no doubt that they loved me. And I actually am pretty certain that most often when they spanked me, they weren't doing it out of cruelty or anger, although occasionally I think that probably happened because it is an act of violence, and acts of violence are inherently cruel and they are inherently tied to anger and emotions. At the very least, the spanking that happened had an effect on me, had an effect on my sense of violence, my sense of security, my sense of love, as it does when any child is grabbed by somebody who is 3 times the size of them and put over their knee and hit and hit and hit. We decided in my family and my family now not to hit, not to spank, and we have never spanked our children because uh, we believe that those acts of violence are so far removed from what we're trying to accomplish as parents, which is to make our children grow up feeling loved and secure and protected. How does a child feel protected if the person who's protecting them will just as easily put them over their knee and start to whip them? I'm not trying to get into a discussion of whether or not you should spank or whether or not that should happen in your household. That's not, I'm just talking about my feelings about it. I want to think about spanking because spanking is an act of hitting, often between one powerful person and the other person who is not so powerful. And in thinking about that, um, spanking might be a ripe place to apply a philosophy of war. Let's just think about the first philosophy that we had this week, which was this dominance theory that I am developing, and that we covered in class. The dominance theory that is related to might makes right, that is related to a sense of realist war, that those who are powerful can use their power as a way of dominating over somebody else. And from doing that, can then attain what they want to accomplish out of that dominance. So, in a dominance theory, a child is spanked because the child offends. The dominant power decides to stop that offense or punish that offense or correct and teach that offense or destroy that offense. And so the child is spanked. That's a nutshell of what dominance theory is, and we can take that, of course, and then apply it globally to dominance theory with different states and different powers. And I will do that here in just a minute. I just want to go over the other theories. Just war theory, the theory that says we have to look at the causes of war, the ways we enact a war, and what happens after a war. Just war theory would say that a child offends, the offended party, the adult, considers the appropriate and justified action in response. Violence is used as a last resort there, but anybody who has raised children will tell you that there is always comes a moment where there is just no talking to that child. The child will not listen, and you have to figure out something else. So violence is used as a last resort, and the child gets spanked. Ideally, in just war theory, the violence that you use is restrained and focused. It has a target. It stays on the target. It is focused on that target to accomplish your goals, and it doesn't go further. That is the idea that non-combatants or a too drastic approach doesn't happen. A nuclear war, for instance. And then, of course, in just war theory, there is the what happens after war. Violence is remediated. It's corrected. It's solved through healing, usually through in a war situation through making sure that the other country can rebuild, or for a child, maybe hugging them and telling them you're sorry that you hit them because you really love them anyway. A nonviolent approach would say that the child offends, does something wrong, draws on a wall, talks back, hits their brother, does something, the child offends. The offended party considers appropriate and justified action in response. And that there's an extra added element here with nonviolent approach that often happens through discourse with others. You talk with others about what is appropriate. You don't just decide that yourself. And then the actions and the outcomes are negotiated with the offending party. You not only talk to others for advice and for consent and for figuring out what you want to do, but then you talk to the person who did the problem, who's causing the problem, and you try to negotiate what should be done, what outcomes might happen if it's done again, and how what should be done to resolve the issue. If the offending party doesn't change their action, if they continue those actions, then direct nonviolent action might be taken that limits the child's choices without causing physical harm. They have some time to reflect. They have an object taken away, and they can no longer use that for a moment, for a little while, to solve their issues. You think about how your choices might be limited for what the child might do. After that solution comes about, ideally, reconciliation tries to reinforce and rebuild a beloved connection. You try to fix whatever harm happened from the nonviolent action so that you can enter into a relationship again, a healthy relationship. Spanking is actual harm. It causes harm, and uh, so does war. War causes harm. The intention when you hold a gun is that you have the possibility of shooting somebody or something. It causes harm. It has at its very core, the idea of war has at its very core that you will kill somebody. Philosophies of war, philosophies of how to engage in war, or why we engage in war, or what is the purpose of war, are important. And they lead us to understanding human actions. When we can understand war through a dominance theory, it helps us understand the motivations of some groups, some nations, some politicians. When we can understand war through a just war theory, it gives us a framework for deciding whether or not something is just, whether or not it should be happening. When we can understand war through a nonviolence approach, we can understand what is the ultimate purpose of us being humans together on this earth, and what might be best way to approach each other so that we can engage healthily with each other. Spanking is a place to start here to think about why we take violent action. Particularly, why do we take violent actions in our own homes with the people that we love? And if we can do that with a child, what does it mean that when we enter into society, when we drive down the street, when we engage with another country, when entire armies face each other across the battlefield? I don't know that we can solve all these things. The point of this week is for you to get an exposure to this idea of violence and war, and to think about what you think as you look at current events, because these current events right now are wrenching out hearts. At the same time that they're also destroying hearts and killing hearts. These current events are just so heartbreaking to see the people that are being killed, to see the violence that is erupting. For me, I often have to ask, is violence ever just? Is it ever appropriate to engage in violence? You know, we covered three different theories this week: this idea of dominance theory, this idea of just war, and this idea um, of nonviolence. There's a fourth one, and it's related to nonviolence, but it's not quite the same thing: pacifism, that says that you never engage in violence, no matter what. You never take any kind of action that would be violent against somebody else, and that includes physical violence or vocal violence or psychological violence or even economic violence. That you reduce all violences and never attempt to engage in violence, because violence begets violence. Think about it. Violence it always leads to more violence. It will make the violent person more likely to engage in violence. It will make the nonviolent person to maybe turn to violence at some point in their life. Is violence ever just? I don't know that I can answer that. I used to believe that pacifism was the only way forward, but I became a father, and I had to think about what I would do if somebody was to hurt my child. I became a spouse, and I had to think about what would happen if somebody tried to hurt my spouse. Uh, I'm not sure I believe that violence is never just, but um, I, I do struggle with it a little bit. In giving this some thought this week, I came up with some rationales for situations of justified violence. When might violence be appropriate? And I think these would fall more in the nonviolence area. Um, Martin Luther King's ideals, because it gets a little bit hard to work that out. Let me just go through these ideas. Defense against an equal force that means harm to another. There is an equal force, a force of somewhat equal power that is going to harm another, and you believe that other needs to be defended. There's a spot where you might engage with somebody else physically or mentally or psychologically in a violent act. I'd say an equal force because you don't want to do that with an unequal force. You don't want to attack a weaker force to protect another weaker force. You could just figure out how to make that not happen through your own presence. Or you don't want to attack a stronger force because that is just leading to a violence that's never going to be resolved peacefully. You're going to either die or you're going to get harmed. Defense against an equal force. That seems to make sense as a space for violence. Extremely muted violence to protect one from self-harm or from harming others. That means if somebody is going to hurt themselves, if some country is going to hurt themselves, or if they're going to hurt somebody else, then figuring out some way to stop them from doing that. And sometimes that might lead to violence. I think violence in sport, that makes sense. That I don't think that's such a bad thing. If you agree to a violence in sport, then you're making that choice, right? Somebody is not acting in violently towards you. You are agreeing to be violent together, which is weird for me, but go for it. I would say unspoken threats of violence to prevent harm in response to nonviolent threats. That might be okay. And as a big male with a deep voice, a presence, I occasionally use this unspoken threat of violence to protect harm in response to other threats. So I remember one time I was at a concert with my daughter, and there were these guys that were very drunk beside us, and they kept on jumping over and slamming into us. And I just kind of moved between her and them and dared them to do it again. I don't know that I would have gotten violent in that situation other than just to be a blockade, but that seems appropriate. And then finally, a contained, limited violence to restrain against social infractions. And that's talking specifically about people who have the authority to prevent crimes or infractions. So a teacher restraining a child from harming somebody else. Maybe even a police officer restraining somebody from doing something violent. We have to be careful with policing and how we talk about that because there is often not constrained violence, not limited violence on the policing part. But I believe if it's used to keep the peace, violence might at times be appropriate. These ideas, I think they work with at least two of our philosophies this week. They work with nonviolence, and they work with just war theory. And it's a way of taking just war theory and saying, maybe war is not okay, but if we were to narrow down that just war theory a little bit and say, here are some situations where, at the very least, it's okay to protect people, then maybe just war theory becomes more just. I wanted to present to you another philosophy, another side. And this would be a feminist idea of peace. This is a good expression of it. Patriarchy finds its ultimate expression in war. And I guess I should explain patriarchy. Patriarchy is this notion that masculinity rules the world, or the father figure rules the world. And patriarchy is very organized from a top-down structure of power that tells other people what to do, and everybody does it. And everybody fights under that person to get to the higher level because it's all about who's on top. It's a patriarchal notion is a very old notion, and many of our societies are built around that notion. So patriarchy finds its ultimate expression in war. War is the field in which the tough can prove their toughness, and the winners triumph over losers. Soldiers can be coerced into dying or killing when their fear of being called womanlike or cowardly overrides their reluctance to face or deal with death. War removes every argument for tenderness and dissolves all strictures on violence. War is the justification for the clampdown that lets rulers impose control on every aspect of life. Starhawk, the person who wrote this essay, and you can find this essay online, uh, um, argues that patriarchy, this sense that there has to be a top down control in society, is what causes war, and that it finds its ultimate expression in war. We have patriarchy that runs through our educational systems, as through our business systems, through most corporations, this sense of ultimate power and profit, led by a single individual. And what Starhawk is saying is that idea is most clearly expressed in war, where one side is trying to dominate another, and that all the rules except for dominance go out the window. The what might be what her suggestion is that we think a little bit more about a feminist approach. How do we approach each other with a sense of community and collectiveness, recognizing that this is just one ball within a galaxy, within all of reality. This is just one ball that we all live on. How can we best figure out how to do that? Spanking is a way to start to think about violence. War is, of course, the ultimate expression of violence, and we're seeing a lot of it. And it's scary, and it's heart wrenching, and um, we would be we will be much better off as a world when this current act of violence stops, when Israel can decide that they're not going to invade others' lands, and when extremist people just decide that they can't act in the voice of all people, all the people of their neighborhood. When this current violence ends, maybe we'll be a step closer to peace. I'm not a religious person, and but I have a religious background, so I just want to read these three short prayers for peace. These come from the International Day of Peace from 1986, um, and where people of multiple faiths came together to um, express a need for peace in the world. And those multiple faiths include people like me who don't really have a set religion. Let me read these three. A Jewish prayer for peace. Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, that we may walk the paths of the Most High. And we shall beat our swords into plowshares, and our spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. And none shall be afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. An Islamic prayer for peace. Praise be to the Lord of the universe, who has created us and made us into tribes and nations, that we may know each other, and not that we may despise each other. If the enemy incline towards peace, do thou also incline towards peace, and trust in God, for the Lord is the one that heareth and knoweth all things. And the servants of God, most gracious, are those who walk on the earth in humility, and when we address them, we say, Peace. A Christian prayer for peace. But I say to you that hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To those who strike you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from those who take away your cloak, do not withhold your coat as well. Give to everyone who begs from you, and of those who take away your goods, do not ask them again. And as you wish that others would do unto you, so do unto them. These prayers are each drawn from the religious texts of these faith traditions, and they each speak to a beauty of human relationships. Philosophy can help guide the world. We have to tell each other about philosophy. We have to tell each other about our faiths. We have to tell each other about ourselves. And hopefully we see that the strong should not hit the weak. And the weak should, I don't know what I was going to say there. The weak should be able to live in freedom, live without oppression. The weak are no less important than the strong. I hope you're having a good week. There were some resources that I mentioned online if you're getting stressed out about all the talk of violence in the world today. I hope you're finding some solace in the philosophy that might tell us different ways that we could get out of violence. Go in peace.